In the first module, we're going to cover installing and configuring Active Directory domain services. Now, again, if you've been in this field quite a bit, you may be familiar with what Active Directory is, but this section really gives you a detailed understanding around how you can manage users, groups, objects, and attributes in Active Directory. So we want to make sure that we understand how that platform works. So what we're going to do is kind of walk you through what you need to prepare for on the exam, as well as what's changed, as well as PowerShell scripts and things of that nature. You'll be able to kind of see how that looks and what you need to do to prepare for it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on there and just kind of go into the section, installing and configuring Active Directory domain services. And this is essentially what we start off covering. Everything from installing a new forest. Let's say if you wanted to start up a new organization, one of the first things you have to kind of think about is a new forest. Then we're going to think about, just domain controllers, how many domain controllers we have, upgrading domain controllers, the server core installation requirements that are required, and all the way down to the DNS services, the records that you need to know about, and lastly, seizing roles, master roles, and things of that nature. So that first section kind of focuses primarily on what you need to know in terms of installing and configuring Active Directory, as your first step. And, Joe?
And a lot of us have been using Active Directory since 2000 when it first came out. We're talking 17 years now. And so you'll see terms that we're going to talk about in this slide deck in this section called a site, a forest, a domain controller, the old FSMO roles, or flexible single master operations, also known as operations masters. So these are some terms we're going to cover. And if you're familiar with Active Directory, again, you've been using it for 17 years, you may do okay on this section of the exam. If Active Directory is new to you, then pay close attention. Again, this is about 25% of the exam.
So the terms that we want you to be familiar with are some of the terms that Joe just mentioned. What's a site? What's a forest? Domains and trees. How do they fit into the full model? So again, once you first start that process of learning, make sure you're familiar with those terms. Global catalog servers, when do I install them? And what servers do I install it? If I need to have a read-only domain controller, at what point do I use that read-only domain controller? So you'll be tested against that. And you can see we also have an image of the Active Directory Administrative Center, which is fairly new with Server 2012 and Server 2016.
That came out with 2012, and now we're in 2016, and it got carried forward. But one of the nice features that is available, and you see the very bottom left corner of that, is the Windows PowerShell module. And what that does is, even though you may right-click, new organizational unit, you can click on that and it shows you what actually happened in PowerShell in the back end. So next time you can actually script it out if you wanted to.
One of the reasons why we like that is because the exam, again, is focused not just on knowing the terms, but knowing how to execute the request in a PowerShell command. And I'll show you some of that in the demo. But the important piece here is to remember that the Active Directory Administrative Center expands on the possibilities of what you can do in terms of managing users and groups in Active Directory, and very easy to use.
And there's also something in ADAC, Active Directory Administrative Center, called the recycle bin. And we'll talk about that later on, but what the recycle bin does, it allows you to retrieve a recycled or deleted object.
And we're talking about it now, huh?
Right, we'll start there. It allows you to, you can enable it from the Active Directory Administrative Center, and it allows you to retrieve a deleted object.
And that's definitely very valuable when you're having to recover data, when you have to look up information about a user that you may have deleted 2-3 weeks ago. Once you enable that recycle bin, you can kind of move forward. So those terms are very important. Understand how those terms work. What's a site, right? We talk about going from site to site administration, where you have a boundary in terms of where a server or user actually logs into. That might be a site. And then subnets actually fitting in underneath that.
And the subnet's actually defining the site, right? So a site, a lot of us know of site as a geographic location. The 4 walls surrounding my building as a site, but that's just a location. It's the subnets that create the site. You could have 5 or 6 different buildings, with a high-speed connection between them, even in different cities, and it can fall under the same one site.
And then also with that, you have to tie in the domain controllers, where you're going to place your domain controllers, and which sites are those domain controllers going to be in. Be familiar with those terms. How many domain trees will I have? Will I have just a single domain, which is just a single structure, if my organization was contosa.com, or would it be corp.contosa.com, hr.contosa.com? Those structures really kind of help you define how you want to manage your Active Directory. You will be tested on knowing those terms and understanding how they work in the platform.
Right, and it's not a vocabulary test, right? It's not going to say, hey, what's a site, A, B, C, D. But you'll have to understand the scenario as it's presented to you and on the basis of the knowledge of what a site, what a tree or a forest or a trust actually is.
And the other side of that is that we think about it in terms of automation. And one of the big benefits we're seeing with Server 2016 and the later platforms is really learning how important PowerShell scripts can be, how they can help you speed up the process of using the solutions as needed. So the big piece that we see happening now is understand how PowerShell works. I have specific commands that are utilized to actually install different features, set up a new domain controllers. Yep. Of course, you can use the GUI. If you were in your console, you can actually go to Start and Server Manager.
I'll actually show you that in just a minute.
Walk through the process. Yep. But the PowerShell commands, understanding how the language works, install ADDS for us. For example, this is just basically installing corp.contosa.com, all the way down to installing a read-only domain controller, which is a much more secure way of managing users in a domain that's protected. All these commands, PowerShell commands, can be found. For example, if you went to the PowerShell GUI itself, you would be able to just type it in, and it'll show you all those.
Import the Active Directory modules, and you can see all the actions available to you.
Exactly.
So I have a server on my screen right now that I'm going to promote up to a domain controller. I have a domain already, and it's the mvalabs.local domain.
Everyone should know what Server Manager is, right?
Yep. As soon as you log into Server 2016, Server Manager pops open automatically. So again, I can just go to Manage, Add and Remove Features. And we just talked about you can do this through PowerShell instead, right? You can go open a PowerShell command, a PowerShell window, and you can import the Active Directory module, and you can use the commands we had on the slide.
And there are portions of the test that test you on actually clicking through options.
You may have to click through options, or you'll see here, I'm going to go ahead and skip this first page. I'm going to install a role, and that role on my server is going to be Active Directory Domain Services. So as I click that, it says, hey, when you install Active Directory Domain Services, you're also going to get these features. Do you want them? Yes, I do. So add features. Next. And again, any other features I wanted to add. Now, this one, I can learn a little bit about Active Directory. Let's go ahead and click Next. Do I want to restart the destination server automatically if required? I never select that. That's up to you if you want to. You'll also see that I can export my configuration settings on what I want to do right now. Export the configuration settings into installation media, or I can select specify an alternate source path.
And now that's important is if you are planning to do some sort of automated process of deploying Server 2016 to domain controllers or any systems, you can actually export those settings and then use that in a batch file or script to automatically upgrade a number of DCs or servers that you have positioned in sites, in offices, and in remote locations. Pass it off to the administrator and say, hey, listen, I need you to upgrade this machine. And all it's going to do is run that PowerShell command, a PowerShell script, and as long as those machines are either prepared to be able to be updated to a DC promo, you'll be able to kind of install ADDS on those systems as well.
And so right now, notice we haven't run any kind of DC promo. We haven't promoted this to a domain controller. All we've done now is added the role. So I'm going to go ahead and install that. And while that's going, it says I can close the wizard if I want to. This is going to take a couple of minutes. So while this is going, let's go back to the slides, and then I'll bounce back to this in just a moment. So what you'll see when we do this, when I get into the DC promo portion of this, I'm not going start run DC promo like we did in Windows 2000. I'm not, or even Server 2008 if you wanted to. We're actually going to do it right from this wizard. So let's go back to my screen. Installation is just about to finish up.
So what's happening right now? It's just basically...
So what it's doing right now is it's basically installing the services. It's making sure my machine's ready. It's actually running a prereq check as well. So it's making sure that everything is good to go when I do run the DC promo feature. And again, this is going to run right from this screen. So now that this is ready, you can see what it did. It installed Active Directory Domain Services. It installed the Group Policy Management Console, the RSAT tools, the Remote Server Administration tools for Server 2016. And then you can see here, promote the server to a domain controller.
Now, this is one that's actually interesting, and notice that it's actually highlighted in blue. One of the type of questions that they may ask you is, how do I actually go about promoting the server to DC? Yep. And make sure that you understand that it's different than just installing the Active Directory services on the server.
Yep, and you see all the other features, so I click on this, and now is where I get to say, okay, I want to create a new forest. Add a brand new forest. I have a new company, or I'm starting Active Directory from scratch, and I'm going to migrate users over. And a reason to do this is a lot of companies, we just said Active Directory is like 17 years old, and a lot of companies have group policies for the last 17 years. And they've been upgrading and migrating, upgrading and migrating so that they have hundreds and hundreds of group policy objects. Or old users in groups that are no longer valid. So we can create a whole new forest to start from scratch in Server 2016. Or I want to just try out some of the new Server 2016 features that without affecting my actual production forest. So I'm going to install a new forest. I can add a new domain to an existing forest. I have my mvalab.local, and I want to create an ammer.mvalab.local or a corp.mva.local. Or just add a new domain controller to an existing domain, which is where I'm going to go to right now. Who has the rights to perform this? Next. Do I want this to be a DNS server? It already is I already have a DNS server, but if I'm going to do Active Directory DNS integrated zones.
Notice that the options that you have here to set the server up as a global catalog server, as well as whether you want to set it as a read-only domain controller. Now again, if you're doing the PowerShell command, you have to specify that in the PowerShell command line so that it knows the difference.
Now there are some reasons that you don't want this to be a global catalog server, and the biggest reason for that is if you have, remember, a global catalog server has a replica of the entire forest's database. If you have a smaller domain controller, not enough disk space, or it's a less secure domain controller, but it has to be writable, or if it's going to be an infrastructure master, actually, and we'll talk about the FSMO roles in a little while, you would uncheck global catalog server. I don't want this to be a global catalog server. And then later on in life, you can go back and make it one if you choose to, and I'll show you that as well in a little while. I need a password to get into Active Directory restore mode, so go ahead and enter that password.
So DSRM, just keep in mind, is around the Directory Services Restoration mode. Make sure that you know that password. But again, for the exam, when you're thinking about it, if they ask you about DSRM, it really is a way to be able to recover objects that may have been deleted during some sort of Active Directory disaster recovery scenario. So this is one way of doing it.
Or to reclaim disk space, compact the Active Directory database.
And the other way was the recycle bin, is just restoring objects.
Okay, I already have delegation of the DNS server cannot be created. I'm not worried about that because I actually have a DNS server. Now install from media. This is also known as IFM, and you'll see this on the exam as IFM install from media. The reason I would do something like this, again, is because we have a domain controller that's across a slow WAN link. When I install Active Directory on this domain controller, it's going to contact a domain controller that has a full database, a full schema, a full everything, and it's going to start copying all of that across a slow WAN. So what I can do here is I can say, you know what, I want to install from media. I'm going to create this domain controller, run DC promo, but someone at the home office has run through this created media, sent it to me, and all I have to do is point to where that media is. Now it's all local traffic instead. I have a full database. Once it comes up and running, yes, it will contact the other domain controller just for any changes since this was created. I'm going to uncheck that and replicate from any domain controller or a specific one that's close by.
Again, this is another change that you see in Server 2016, the fact that you can actually select the domain controller that you want to have replication coming from.
And technically, you want to put your database log sysvol on these databases on just on a different drive.
And this is important because if you're looking to speed up the performance on the box and you want to make sure that you keep the database and the logs in a separate location if ever need to be cleaned up, you have the option of switching it. Now, for larger organizations that have a number of storage spaces and drive letters, you can actually select separate drive letters with faster spindles to reduce the amount of overhead that you would expect to see on your domain controllers as well.
On my VM, I have a single partition. It's the C drive. Next, review my options.
Now this is important too, right? So, and I'm glad you clicked on that. What happens is once you start that process, it's literally
you can't. It's previous is grayed out. There's nothing I can do at this point. So if I hit next and I'm like, no! The best I can do is try to close out of everything. But look, first it runs a prereq check, and then I can actually cancel out of this. I don't have to continue with it. And I actually am going to cancel out because this next step is simply just to install Active Directory. Anything that has this little warning, you probably want to take a look at, but it's not going to prevent Active Directory from installing. If there's an error, maybe it's a disk space error or a credential error or something like that, you would have to fix that before you could click install. All prereq checks completed.
If you're doing this at home or if you're doing this in your own test environment, make sure that you're paying attention to this because if you end up with a red error, make sure you read through it, understand what's happening. If you're preparing for the exam, read through each one of those options, understand what the yellow warnings are. They're not going to prevent you from installing Active Directory, but they may indicate that you might have a degraded system once everything is up and running.
Right. And once I have fixed that, I can just rerun my prereq check again.
And it should give you the...
I haven't made any changes. It'll give me the same exact warnings, errors, whatever I had, but hopefully everything would come back green. All right, so again, once this finishes up, I'm just going to go ahead and click Cancel. Let's go back to our slides. So what you saw was the GUI way, the wizard way to install Active Directory. And on the slide deck, we show you all the different PowerShell commands you can do for accomplish the same
yeah, and
tasks.
Again, add Windows features, name, and you can see some of the other components that get added on there as well as include management tools where you're going to add things like the directory services, the ADAC, all of that gets added on there. If you were doing a read-only domain controller, you'd have the last option available as well. So all of the GUI that you just saw Joe walk through in the underpinnings of directory services and Windows Server 2016, they're all being executed via PowerShell. So if you do it through a PowerShell script, you're actually just executing the process the way it was naturally meant to be done.
And another reason that you might do it that way through the PowerShell is if server core.
Exactly.
Right? I have a server core. What is that? It's a server without a management interface. There's no GUI. It's only a command prompt.
And we'll talk about that in 7740.
Another series, we'll bring that up as well.
It's one of my favorites. So, the other pieces, we actually have additional common Active Directory installation functions that we've shared with you as well, where you can have the additional components of I don't want to specify the global catalog server.
Right.
I want to give it an installation media path for the IFM itself. Or I want to uninstall Active Directory as a domain controller. All those options are available. So the reason why we're placing these PowerShell scripts in the actual deck is we want you to be familiar with them, understand why they matter, because when you're faced with 5 different PowerShell scripts, you have to know which one will actually do the work of removing the domain controller.
Now, fortunately, you don't have to, on the exam, type out from scratch a PowerShell command. You'll probably have to click and drag the right verbs and actions and nouns from the left to the right or right to the left. I'm not sure how you're actually facing me right now. So you'll have to drag them from one side to the other.
And lastly, we have the FSMA rules, and we kind of wanted to make sure that you were familiar with this. Again, if you are an expert or semi-expert in the Active Directory, FSMA roles, flexible single masters operation roles, should not be anything fairly new to you. It really is the fact that there are a number of different roles that can be hosted on a domain controller, and so we've kind of talked about them from a role perspective. In the slide that you're seeing here, we have transferring and seizing FSMA roles, which is the idea of when you have given a specific role to a domain controller, you can then decide on how to move it from one domain controller to another.
Yep. Now, to go over those FSMA roles, again, they're flexible single master operations. They're also known as operations masters. And back in 2000, or even 99, when Active Directory was still being written and coded, they were called FSMO. And you'll still see, if you were to open up Active Directory, you would still see them called FSMO. But everywhere in the GUI, they're called operations masters. So I have Active Directory used on computers. I can do the same thing from ADAC. Again, that's the new feature. I happen to open up Active Directory using computers. And you can see, if I right-click my domain, that I have operations masters. Now, on the slide, you saw that there were 5 of them, and we'll go over these 3 first. So there's the PDC emulator, the RID master, and the infrastructure master. So the PDC emulator is, back in the NT days, there was the primary domain controller and backup domain controllers, and that's where the PDC emulator comes from. The PDC emulator, primary domain controller, is responsible for things like synchronization and time sync and group policies. It's basically, it's the head honcho domain controller. If this one goes down, you'll know it almost immediately. And that's where you get to something like transferring or seizing the master operations role. You transfer it. I know I'm doing updates on this domain controller Saturday at 3 a.m. So I'm going to transfer that role to another domain controller while that machine is applying the updates and shutting down and rebooting. And then once it's back up again, I'm going to transfer it back. Right? So that's the PD simulator. It's very important that that one's always running. The RID master is the next one. So if you look at the RID master on my screen, you see that's the relative ID. And basically what happens is all writable domain controllers get a block of RIDs from the RID master. You create a user account. As an administrator, I log into my machine. I run my RSAT tools, the remote server administration tools. I create a user account either through PowerShell or through the GUI, and it gets assigned a security identifier, or a SID. That SID is broken into two pieces. There's the relative ID of the user, of the object, and the ID of the domain itself. So you get a block of RIDs. Now, if that RID master were to go down, if you're going to be updating it and rebooting it, you may not need to transfer that role, right? Because every writable domain controller has a block of RIDs. You won't even notice it's down until a domain controller is out of RIDs and goes to access it. So on the exam, you get a question like, you go to create a user account, all domain control, server 1 or DC1 is down, the action failed, transfer the RID master role, right? Probably the writable domain controller you connected to ran out of RIDs, couldn't get a new one. And then the infrastructure master. This is my favorite one, the infrastructure master. Because of what it means, the infrastructure master resolves inconsistencies between cross-domain referenced objects. It's a mouthful, right? Resolves inconsistencies between cross-domain referenced objects. What that means basically is, I have a user account, and I always use a female for this because it's easy to understand why she would change her name. So I have a user account, Rachel Smith. Rachel Smith is in my domain, but is referenced in another domain as part of a group. So she's in the corp.mvalabs.com or .local domain, and she's accessing resources in the america.mvalabs.local domain. So she's cross-domain referenced object. She's in one domain, but she's referenced in another one. Rachel Smith gets married. When she gets married, she changes her name. Now, the domain controller in her own domain knows that her name was changed. The domain controller in the other domain doesn't know that. That's an inconsistency between a cross-domain referenced object. The infrastructure master will resolve that. Now, one thing that we said earlier is you may not want a domain controller to be a global catalog because the global catalog, or because that server is the infrastructure master. The reason you don't want them on the same role is global catalogs never have inconsistencies between cross-domain referenced objects. They just don't. They have full databases. So if you have a global catalog server, the infrastructure master role is not working. It's not that it's broken. You're not going to get any errors. It's just not doing its functions. So that's 3 of the operations masters. Do you have anything to add while I pull up?
No, I think you're right. And the other pieces that I want to mention is the other 2, the schema master and the domain naming master, are forest wide roles that basically you can only have one in the entire forest. Schema master would basically own all of the attributes, the information around what your Active Directory infrastructure looks like. Think of it as a skeleton. It knows exactly how many attributes are there, and if you need to update the schema, you would update that schema master. You have to have a schema master admin rights to do that. And the domain naming master obviously owns the aspect of owning the domain as well.
So you saw we opened up Active Directory users and computers for the first 3, the PDC emulator, the RID master, the infrastructure master. Active Directory domains and trusts, you can see on my screen now, is where I'm going to change the domain naming master. Again, don't right-click on the domain, right-click on Active Directory domains and trusts, because as Alfred just said, this is a forest-wide role, not a domain-wide role. So this one you actually right-click on the actual forest name, or the console name. Operations master, and I have my operations master here, is this one. I want to change it to a different one. I didn't go through with my DC promo in the last demo, so I only have my one domain controller. Right, but again, so the domain naming master, what can't you do if this one goes down? You can't add or remove domains, you can't add or remove trusts, and you can't add or remove, I got trusts, so you can't add or remove trusts. You also can't do UPNs, actually.
User principal names.
User principal names, and we'll talk about those in a little while, but those are 3 things you can't do if the domain naming master is down. The last one that Alfred mentioned is the schema master. Now, there is no Active Directory schema. There's an Active Directory schema. There's no console called Active Directory schema like there's Active Directory using computers. So to get there, the first thing you have to do is you have to register the DLL for this. So you're going to run a regserv32, and I always run that first because whether it's regsvr32 or regsrv32, I always forget. So I always run just the command first. And then you're going to run the schema, mmgmt.dll. You're going to register that DLL. Succeeded. Then you're going to open up a Microsoft Management Console. add the snap-in of Active Directory schema. Okay. Here is the schema, and here's my operations master. Now, in all of these cases, you can either transfer the role or you can forcibly transfer the role. If the machine crashed, you would forcibly transfer the role. If the machine is up and running and it's going to be just transferred again during a reboot, you're going to nicely transfer the role.
Nicely, very nicely.
Very nicely.
So we covered those 5 roles particularly because we wanted you to understand those are the sort of things that you'll see on the exam, especially when you're talking about installing a domain controller, Active Directory infrastructure. Some of the other things that we haven't mentioned so far are just things like DC cloning. You can actually clone your DCs and exclude application lists so that you can basically take the information that's already built on a single DC and transfer it to like a virtual VM that's a DC as well, and use that as a way to extend or increase the number of DCs without having to go through the whole process all over again. The other thing that we didn't cover as much is also upgrading your servers from Windows Server 2008 to 2012 or 2016. So you can do that as well using the AD domain prep script or PowerShell script to actually do the upgrade. And at that point, you're taking the server from Server 2012 or 2008 function level to 2016. So those are 2 things that we want to mention. But for the most part, you kind of see what we're talking about. The first step of understanding this portion of the exam is to understand what you need to know for installing Active Directory and the domain itself. So I don't know, Joe, anything else you wanted to add?
That's good. I'm glad you brought up DC cloning. That was on the tip of my tongue that I was coughing to get out.
So we really, as we go into the next section, we're hoping you kind of enjoyed this conversation and understand how and what you need to do to prepare. And we look forward to seeing you in other sessions.